At dawn, the street should have been quiet. But there was no quiet. There were screams. The kind of screams that do not belong to the living. They belong to the fractured memory of a civilization being undone. And there she was, the queen, standing atop the marble balcony, the first rays of sunlight catching the faint curve of her lips. She smiled. Not the smile of joy. Not the smile of a ruler pleased with her people. It was something colder, calculated. A smile that carried the weight of centuries of hidden agendas, of promises made to shadows, of a world built upon secrets and lies. It was a smile that told the world, I am above you. I see all. And none of this touches me. Her people clawed at life below. Flames licked the corners of their homes. Soldiers marched not for protection, but for control. Precision instruments of fear, trained to obey without question. Every scream, every moment of panic, was a note in the symphony of power she conducted. And yet, no one would speak of it afterward. Not officially. History would call it an unfortunate rebellion, or a tragedy, and the true orchestration would vanish into the shadows. The queen's gaze didn't waver. Behind it lay knowledge the world was not meant to touch. Forbidden texts, ancient rituals, and counsel whispered by unseen masters. She understood the architecture of control, how to bend the minds of men, how to silence truth while dressing it as law, how to make the powerless dance in patterns that only served her eternity. And her smile, that smile was the signature of mastery. No one noticed the small symbols carved into the pillars behind her, symbols that had survived countless regimes, symbols of allegiance older than kingdoms, symbols of men and women who had built empires not on love or honor, but on fear and secrecy. She did not just inherit this power. She had become it. And in that moment, as dawn crept across the horizon, she was no longer just a queen. She was the quiet god of the collapse, the unseen hand shaping terror while wearing silk and pearls. This was not just history. This was a blueprint. And tonight, I will show you the steps, each one darker than the last, of how empires are shaped, how minds are controlled, and how one woman's smile can mark the beginning of a world burning from within. They whispered her name in fear, though no one dared speak it aloud in the streets. Even the wind seemed to bend around her palace, carrying rumors that never reached beyond the walls. Power like haze is never accidental. It is cultivated in silence, in shadows, in the delicate breaking of those who thought themselves untouchable. The queen understood that terror was not merely a tool, it was a language, and she spoke it fluently. Inside the palace, the corridors were lined with mirrors that did more than reflect faces. They reflected obedience. Each visitor, each courtier, was scrutinized for cracks, tiny hesitations, micro-expressions, the slightest flicker of doubt. Those who faltered would vanish quietly. History would forget them. Their names would be erased as if they had never existed, leaving only whispers in servant quarters and scattered fragments of correspondence that scholars would misinterpret centuries later. She commanded not just armies, but perception itself. The people believed they saw a ruler, but what they saw was a carefully orchestrated illusion. Behind the curtains, behind the golden chandeliers, decisions were guided by ancient texts, manuals of psychological dominion written in cipher, forgotten by the world, preserved only for those willing to wield the darkness without flinching. Each word, each decree, was a calculated step in a game that spanned generations. The queen's smile, the smile at dawn, was a warning, not to her enemies alone, but to every man who thought freedom was natural. There is a force in the world, unseen yet palpable, that shapes history without mercy. She had tapped into it. She had learned the unspoken rules. Fear can be distilled into obedience, chaos can be molded into structure, and loyalty, when properly manipulated, becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. But the most terrifying truth is this: she was not alone. There were others. Hidden councils, ancient bloodlines, institutions older than the kingdoms themselves. They had survived because they mastered the same arts of control, the same orchestration of fear and illusion. She was their instrument, and, in some ways, their masterpiece. Every scream that echoed at dawn was a note in the symphony of their unseen power, and she conducted it like a maestro with a dark heart. Tonight, as you listen, you will begin to see the threads connecting these forces. Threads that run beneath every law, every empire, every history book that claims to tell the truth. These threads bind the present to the forbidden past, and once you follow them, you cannot return to ignorance. You cannot unhear what I am about to reveal. Her power did not begin with her coronation. It began in whispers long before the palace walls existed. Generations of clandestine teachers, exiled priests, and forgotten alchemists had passed down knowledge designed to bend men's wills and enslave their minds without the use of chains. They called it the doctrine of shadows, a system so precise that one could predict not only the behavior of armies, but the heartbeat of an entire city. And she, the queen who smiled at dawn, had been chosen to inherit it. In the dim candlelight of her private chambers, she studied texts written in script so old that scholars dismissed them as nonsense. But each symbol was a key, each ritual a vector for control. She learned to speak in the language of instinct, to plant ideas into the unconscious mind of her people, to orchestrate loyalty, panic, and despair as if they were musical notes. Her enemies never understood why they fell so easily. They never saw the invisible hands tightening around their minds. Bloodlines were not enough. She required initiation, a crucible designed to break ordinary morality and replace it with comprehension of pure, unyielding dominance. They call it the rite of dawn, a ceremony where nothing is as it seems and everything is revealed. Those who failed did not survive. Those who passed emerged changed, able to see the mechanisms of fear and power as clearly as a chessboard in sunlight. She passed. She emerged. And with her smile, she made the world complicit in her knowledge, whether they realized it or not. And yet, this is not merely a story of ancient secrets. Look closely at the patterns of her reign, the selective mercy, the precise cruelty, the calculated compassion that keeps the masses loyal while the elite bend like reeds to her will. Every act, every policy, is an extension of that ancient doctrine. Her kingdom was a living laboratory, a place where she tested not only obedience, but the limits of human perception. The screams at dawn were never random. They were an experiment, recorded in the hidden archives of history, encoded for those who could read the signs. The queen understood a truth that men still refuse to admit. Power is not taken. It is inherited, absorbed, and weaponized through knowledge that most people are not meant to see. And once you comprehend it, once you witness it, you cannot unsee it. The world as you believed it to be, a place of chance, fairness, and morality, is a fragile illusion. She had pierced it. She wore the truth like a crown, and every dawn was a reminder of her mastery. The streets of his city were alive, yet not with freedom. Every movement, every glance, was under scrutiny, even if the observers were invisible. Faye, she understood, was most potent when it was unseen. The queen did not need soldiers in every alley. She needed symbols, rituals, and whispers, mechanisms that trained the mind to obey without realizing it was obeying. Her power worked in the quiet spaces, the seconds between thought and action, the subtle anxiety that creeps into every choice. The rituals began at dawn, long before anyone recognized them as rituals. Public punishments were performed with meticulous choreography, not merely to punish, but to instruct. Every execution, every parade of submission, was a lesson in hierarchy, obedience, and inevitability. The people learned quickly. To survive was to follow the invisible currents. They learned that resistance was not heroic, it was suicidal. And yet, she framed it as order, as justice, as the natural course of civilization. She was not cruelty personified. She was precision. Her psychological manipulations extended beyond fear into loyalty. Festivals, songs, and proclamations were embedded with cues designed to bind the population to her identity. These were not idle celebrations. They were laboratories of the mind. Music, movement, repetition, and reward conditioned obedience like Pavlovian bells, but on a scale of millions. Every citizen unknowingly participated in their own conditioning, and the queen watched the results with a detached smile. She did not just rule them. She rewrote the architecture of their perception. And for the elites, the counselors, the ministers, she offered both terror and privilege. Loyalty was rewarded, disobedience annihilated. But every reward came with subtle indebtedness, psychological change wrapped in silk. They believed themselves free, yet their every thought, every decision, bent around her will. Through ritual, observation, and manipulation, she achieved a level of control that historians would later call mythic. Yet the truth is even darker. It was science, applied ruthlessly, and perfected over centuries. Her citizens did not scream because of her hands alone. They screamed because they realized, too late, that their reality had been constructed to contain them. She had turned an entire society into a living mechanism, a machine of obedience, fear, and dependency. And as she watched from the balcony, her smile at dawn was no longer just a symbol of triumph. It was a signature of a system so complete, so unassailable, that even gods could not intervene without her permission. The queen did not rule alone. Behind her, in the shadowed corridors of power, were men and women whose names have been erased from history. Secret councils older than the kingdom itself, bound by oaths and blood, orchestrated the rise of rulers like her for centuries. They were the unseen architects, the engineers of civilization's deepest machinery. They did not merely advise, they programmed. Every decree, every law, every ritual was designed to save the continuity of their control. These were not ordinary conspirators. They were heirs to forbidden knowledge, keepers of truths the world was never meant to know. Some claimed descent from vanished civilizations, civilizations that had survived catastrophes by mastering manipulation, surveillance, and psychological domination. They understood patterns in chaos, predicting human behavior with unnerving precision. They placed the queen where she would learn the rights, inherit the codes, and enforce their vision. She smiled at dawn not simply because she could, but because she had been groomed to embody their centuries of accumulated mastery. Her advisors were not always visible. They were symbols, texts, and coded rituals. Meetings occurred in hidden chambers, behind layers of secrecy, and decisions were disseminated through subtle channels. Even her closest ministers sometimes questioned if she acted independently or if she was a puppet of forces beyond comprehension. But the truth was far darker. She had absorbed their power. She had outgrown them. And yet, she honored their legacy, for it was their knowledge that had sharpened her mind into a weapon. The council understood the psychology of submission. They taught her to use spectacle, ritual, and symbols to bind the populace, to create obedience indistinguishable from faith. They demonstrated the power of fear, but also of hope, a controlled hope, a mirage that kept her people compliant yet striving. Every human mind became a vector for control, every emotion a tool, and she wielded it with the precision of a master sculptor. And here's the terrifying part. This system, this network, still exists today, in forms you cannot perceive. The patterns repeat. The same forces that shaped her rise, fear, ritual, psychological conditioning, hidden councils, are woven into the fabric of modern institutions, corporations, governments. They are older than democracy, older than kingdoms. And when you understand this, when you see the invisible threads connecting the past to the present, you realize that the Queen's smile was never just history. It was a lesson, a warning, a blueprint. The first ritual of control was simple in appearance, but its effects were profound. The citizens were gathered at dawn, drawn by music, light, and spectacle, a festival in name, a crucible in function. The Queen's smile welcomed them, her gaze scanning the crowd as if reading each heartbeat. No one left unchanged. The air itself seemed charged, heavy with expectation, and each person felt a subtle compulsion to obey, to kneel, to believe. This was no ordinary ceremony. Symbols were painted on the streets, geometric patterns older than the kingdom, invisible to those untrained in their meaning. They aligned the mind, guiding attention, suppressing doubt, and amplifying loyalty. Each chant, each drumbeat, each synchronized movement was designed to resonate not only in the ears but in the psyche. The people were becoming instruments, and the Queen was the conductor of their collective mind. Inside the palace, the ritual had layers unknown to the masses. Observers hidden in balconies and towers watched for reactions, micro-expressions, shifts in posture, even the pacing of breath. These subtle clues were catalogued and memorized. Those who faltered, even slightly, were summoned later for counsel. Few ever returned unchanged. The lessons were invisible but indelible. Obedience is survival, dissent is annihilation, and the Queen is the axis upon which all reality turns. Yet the ritual's genius was psychological, not merely physical. It manipulated perception of time and space. Moments of confusion were interspersed with patterns of order. Fear was alternated with reward. Hope was dangled, then withdrawn. Each participant left believing they had chosen loyalty freely, when in truth, their minds had been calibrated to the rhythm of her command. The smile at dawn was the seal of the process, proof that control had been achieved without overt coercion. And here lies the lesson hidden in plain sight. Power is most absolute when it is invisible. The people did not resist because they believed resistance was futile. But the queen knew something deeper. Resistance was always futile because the very architecture of their perception had been rewritten. She was not only a ruler, she was a master of reality itself, sculpting belief, emotion, and action like clay in her hands. Each ritual, each smile, each precise gesture ensured her dominance was absolute and eternal. The consequences of her rituals were not immediate. They were subtle, creeping into the minds of her people like shadows at dusk. Children learned obedience before they could read. Merchants calculated safety over profit. Soldiers moved with precision, not because of discipline, but because instinct and fear had fused into reflex. Individuality became a liability, creativity a threat, and conformity the only currency of survival. Every soul was being rewritten, and few realized it. The queen understood the human mind as a craftsman understands wood. She knew where to carve, where to smooth, where to leave imperfection that seemed natural. Her people's thoughts, desires, and loyalties were shaped without their awareness. They believed they acted freely, yet every choice had already been anticipated. The screams at dawn, the parades, the ceremonies, they were all instruments in the orchestration of submission. By controlling perception, she controlled reality itself. And yet, fear alone was insufficient. She also engineered hope, subtle and calculated. Rewards were given to obedience, privileges to loyalty, admiration to participation in the system. People learned to crave her attention, to interpret her smile as reassurance rather than warning. She manipulated the duality of terror and desire, and in this tension, her control became absolute. Her people were not merely subjects, they were collaborators in their own enslavement, unknowingly entwined in the machinery of her mind. Long-term obedience required psychological decay. The queen ensured that dependence on her grew with each passing day. Traditions were rewritten, myths created, symbols imbued with power. She planted ideas like seeds that grew into internalized commands. Her citizens no longer needed her visible presence. They felt her influence everywhere, in rituals, in commerce, in whispers of law. The palace was only the source of a system that had metastasized throughout the city, through minds conditioned to obey. And here lies the terrifying truth. This is not merely a story of a distant queen. The patterns she perfected are eternal. Societies are built on similar mechanisms. Fear, hope, ritual, and invisible enforcement shape civilizations. Understanding these patterns awakens a dangerous awareness. Once seen, the machinery behind obedience cannot be unseen. Once recognized, you perceive the shadows behind authority everywhere. She knew that control could never be complete without knowledge. Not knowledge in the ordinary sense, but the intimate, invasive understanding of every thought, every alliance, every hidden desire within her realm. She built a network unlike any other. Spies, informants, and unseen observers who moved through the city like ghosts. No whisper went unheard, no glance unnoticed, no shadow unexamined. Every secret, every potential spark of rebellion, was catalogued and neutralized before it could ignite. Her agents were trained in silence. They spoke without speaking, watched without being seen, and disappeared without trace. They were not soldiers, they were extensions of her mind. Through them, the queen understood the rhythm of life in her kingdom, the unspoken agreements, the concealed rivalries, the latent fears. And she used this knowledge as a weapon far more devastating than armies or weapons. Knowledge is always the sharpest edge, and she wielded it mercilessly. But surveillance alone was not enough. She transformed fear into strategy, shaping even suspicion into obedience. A whispered accusation could destroy a family, yet even this terror was orchestrated to reinforce loyalty. People learned that resistance was both invisible and inevitable. Compliance became the only rational act. Her spies were not simply eyes, they were architects of a living, breathing network of psychological control. They made betrayal impossible because the very idea of betrayal became a trap, a preordained path to ruin. And yet, the genius of her system lay in perception. The populace never saw the network as a threat. They believed in chance, in luck, in the randomness of events. They attributed her power to wisdom, fortune, or divine favor, never realizing the intricate web of observation and manipulation under which they lived. Every gaze, every smile, Every ritual became part of a feedback loop that reinforced obedience, and every act of defiance was quietly anticipated and redirected. This is the dangerous lesson hidden in history. Absolute power does not require brute force. It requires the invisible hand of knowledge, applied with precision. Fear, ritual, observation, and psychology create a web so complete that rebellion is not only unlikely, it becomes unthinkable. And in the shadow of dawn, her smile reminded the city that she was watching, always watching, and that survival meant submission. Power is never maintained by fear alone. The queen understood this instinctively. To command the masses, she needed obedience. To control the elite, she needed complicity. The ministers, generals, and merchants who believed themselves untouchable were quietly ensnared in a web of subtle dominance. She did not merely govern them. She curated their perception of themselves, their desires, their ambitions, and their fears. Each advisor thought they had agency, that their influence mattered. In truth, every decision was pre-channeled by her design. Secrets were currency. She revealed just enough knowledge to make them indispensable to her, but never enough to rival her insight. A misplaced confidence, a misinterpreted order, a forgotten ritual, any mistake could unravel them. And they learned quickly that survival demanded obedience cloaked in the illusion of freedom. The queen used obligation like a sculptor uses a chisel. She rewarded loyalty in ways that seemed magnanimous but carried invisible strings. A title here, a gift there, a whispered confidence. Each act etched invisible debt onto their minds. They became complicit, not just out of fear, but out of desire to maintain status, to belong, to survive in a system whose architecture they could sense but never fully comprehend. Her power over them was invisible, but it was absolute. She also mastered the art of leverage. Every secret, every scandal, every vulnerability was catalogued and remembered. No one could move against her without exposing themselves. They were caught in a psychological trap of her own creation. The more they sought influence, the more dependent they became on her approval, and the tighter the chains of obligation wrapped around them. Their loyalty was self-reinforcing, a cage they built themselves while believing they were free. This manipulation of the elite was more than strategy. It was alchemy. Fear, desire, ambition, and secrecy were combined into a force stronger than any sword. And while the people screamed at dawn, these silent conspirators moved like shadows under her direction, unaware that the hands guiding them were haze alone. They believed themselves masters of their fate, but the queen had already written the story. She was the axis around which every ambition turned, the hidden gravity pulling every action into alignment with her will. Her dominion was not built on swords or wealth alone. It was built on knowledge older than kingdoms, older than religions, forbidden texts, hidden manuscripts, and occult practices passed down through secret orders fed her understanding of the human mind and the mechanics of influence. These were not myths. They were instructions, precise, actionable, terrifyingly effective, and she devoured them, becoming a living repository of wisdom the world was never meant to touch. She studied the rituals that shaped thought and perception, symbols, chants, and sequences that aligned the unconscious mind, bending it toward obedience without overt coercion. They were methods to awaken latent instincts, to create instinctive loyalty, and to weave fear into the very fabric of identity. Every gesture, every decree, every smile was a ritualized act, a precise manipulation of the psychology of the many. The queen became a master not only of the visible world, but of the invisible forces that drive behavior. The manuscripts warned that such knowledge is dangerous. Misuse leads to madness. But she was different. She had been trained, conditioned, initiated. Each ritual she performed, some in public, some in secret, was a controlled experiment in human compliance. The screams at dawn were the inevitable byproduct of these practices. They were the sound of minds confronting the invisible chains she had laid. And she watched, calculating, absorbing, refining her methods. Even her closest advisors sensed something unnatural. They whispered of the eyes of the queen, the sense that she knew things she should not know, that her gaze penetrated deception and intention alike. It was true. Through study, ritual, and careful observation, she had internalized the mechanics of power, becoming a living nexus of strategy, psychology, and the dark arts. She was both student and teacher, both observer and manipulator. And here's the frightening truth. These texts, these practices, still exist. They survive in fragments, in forgotten corners of libraries, encoded rituals preserved by societies who understand that such knowledge must remain hidden from ordinary men. But those who seek them, who dare to follow the path she mastered, can achieve the same terrifying insight, the power to bend human will, to command obedience, to see through the veil of freedom and choice that keeps the masses blind. She did not just rule bodies, she ruled minds. The Queen's greatest conquest was invisible, internal, and total. She shaped identity itself. From childhood, subtle cues, repeated phrases, and orchestrated experiences guided her subjects' sense of self. They believed they were making choices, forming opinions, developing moral codes, but every path led back to her influence. Individual thought became a mirror of her will. Education was weaponized. Stories, songs, and legends celebrated obedience and condemned deviation. Children were taught to revere the system, to internalize her authority as a natural law. Every citizen learned to police not only their actions but their own thoughts, because the Queen had made them complicit in their own subjugation. Doubt was an instinct suppressed by repetition and ritual. Fear and hope intertwined until her influence became invisible, yet undeniable. She engineered belief like a master craftsman. Public rituals tied loyalty to identity. Private ceremonies solidified obedience through emotional resonance. The people did not follow her because they feared death alone. They followed because their very sense of self had been calibrated to serve her purpose. Resistance became unthinkable, not because it was punished, but because it contradicted the reality she had embedded within their minds. Even among the educated and the wealthy, the same invisible architecture worked. Merchants interpreted success as dependent on compliance. Generals saw strategic brilliance and assumed genius, never suspecting manipulation. Advisors misread their own desires as ambition, never realizing they were extensions of his psychological design. Obedience became instinctual, and submission, paradoxically, felt natural. And here lies the terrifying revelation. Once a population's identity is reshaped, they no longer need chains or soldiers. Control becomes invisible, total, and self-enforcing. They maintain the system voluntarily, defending it against anyone who attempts to awaken them. Her smile at dawn was no longer just a spectacle. It was the apex of a process that had transformed consciousness itself. To see it fully is to understand a principle older than empires. Mastery over minds is eternal power. More enduring than wealth, armies, or bloodlines. Power is fleeting if memory is free. The Queen knew this. She became the master not only of minds in the present, but of memory itself. Records were rewritten, names erased, events reframed. What the people remembered was not reality. It was the version she allowed. History became her weapon, an instrument of control that extended across generations, ensuring obedience long after a single lifetime. Monuments, chronicles, and even stories were curated carefully. Heroes who opposed her vanished or were transformed into cautionary figures. Acts of courage were recast as folly. Acts of loyalty magnified into legend. Every narrative was a mirror reflecting her dominance, a method to shape not just memory but identity, so that the populace internalized obedience as natural, inevitable, righteous. They were not merely living under her rule, they were living inside her story. Those who attempted to preserve truth quietly were neutralized with precision. Scholars disappeared. Witnesses to cruelty died under mysterious circumstances. Even whispers were dangerous. And in their absence, the population's perception of reality conformed seamlessly to the illusion she engineered. Control over memory meant control over meaning, and control over meaning meant the Queen's power was absolute. She understood that the mind, unanchored by reliable memory, becomes malleable. Trauma could be reframed as myth, suffering recast as lesson, rebellion rewritten as insanity. Citizens believed in the inevitability of her authority because the past itself had been molded to enforce it. Every child who learned history in her schools inherited obedience before they could question it, and every adult reinforced it unconsciously by passing the truths forward. Even the elite were caught in this invisible net. Decisions based on prior knowledge, assumptions about precedent, interpretations of events, all subtly guided by the history she permitted to exist. They acted within frameworks she had designed, thinking themselves autonomous. Memory was not just preservation, it was architecture. And the Queen was the ultimate architect, shaping reality by determining what could and could not be remembered. Fear is a currency, more valuable than gold or armies. The queen mastered it at the societal level, creating crises and enemies that did not need to exist. The people's terror was carefully curated, ebbing and surging in patterns she alone dictated. Raids, rumors, fires, political plots, they were orchestrated not for necessity, but for effect. Each event was a test, each panic a lesson. Survival depended on obedience. She knew the power of shadows. Unseen threats are more compelling than visible ones. Citizens never needed to see her hand to feel its weight. She planted whispers of conspiracies, mysterious figures lurking in the alleys, and invisible cabals manipulating events. Each rumor, each story, each fearful glance became a thread in a tapestry of control. The population learned to anticipate danger everywhere, yet could never act independently, because the fear was calibrated to paralysis. Even enemies served her purpose. Rebellion was allowed only when it could be contained, observed, and integrated into her system. Those who rose were either destroyed or transformed into instruments of her design. Victory and defeat alike reinforced her narrative. The people believed they were witnessing chaos, but they were witnessing theater, the theater of absolute control. This orchestration extended beyond events into thought itself. Discussions, opinions, even private disagreements were subtly guided by fear of judgment, surveillance, and reprisal. The queen's influence penetrated homes and hearts. She was not only a ruler of streets and palaces, she was the silent governor of consciousness. Her citizens became actors in a drama she directed, performing according to scripts written in shadows and symbols they would never fully perceive. And here's the dangerous truth. When fear is systematized, obedience becomes instinct. People do not resist because their minds have been trained to anticipate danger and seek survival within the imposed order. The queen's smile at dawn was not merely symbolic. It was the proof of her experiment. A population fully conditioned, perfectly aligned with her vision, and incapable of imagining life beyond her control. The machinery of terror, once set in motion, operates independently of her presence. Like a self-sustaining predator feeding on perception and habit, fear alone breeds obedience, but it cannot sustain it. The queen understood this instinctively. To cement her control, she wielded selective mercy as a weapon more powerful than any sword. It was not generosity, it was calculation. Lives were spared, favors granted, and privileges bestowed, but only in ways that ensured dependence, gratitude, and unspoken indebtedness. Citizens learned to crave her approval as a necessity. A farmer spared from confiscation, a soldier allowed to return from battle, a merchant rewarded with a profitable contract. All understood that their survival, their comfort, their very existence, hinged on her favor. Mercy became a currency, a silent chain binding them to her will. It taught the dangerous lesson that obedience was rewarded, and deviation punished, not arbitrarily, but with the precision of inevitability. Even acts of rebellion were manipulated into opportunities for this strategic grace. Those who strayed too far were confronted not only with punishment but with controlled forgiveness, a reminder that her hand could crush or lift, and that both outcomes depended on her discretion alone. The people learned to internalize this logic. Power is wielded not by fairness or morality, but by design, and allegiance is the path to survival. This system extended to the elite as well. Ministers, generals, and advisors received the same calculated mercy. Privileges were granted just enough to maintain loyalty, yet never enough to foster independence. Secrets were revealed in increments, keeping them entangled in obligations they could never fully repay. Gratitude and fear intertwined, creating psychological bonds far stronger than chains or imprisonment. The queen's smile at dawn became a symbol of this duality, terrifying in its cruelty, yet intoxicating in its promise of reprieve. Her people lived in a constant state of tension, their minds calibrated by the alternating rhythms of fear and reward. They believed themselves free, but every act, every thought, every hope had been shaped to serve her enduring design. She had mastered not just the physical, but the invisible, intangible architecture of obedience. Isolation is the crucible of control. The queen understood that collective strength threatens absolute power. So she fractured communities, sowed suspicion, and nurtured dependence on her presence alone. Families were subtly divided, alliances undermined, and friendships infiltrated with whispers. Every bond that might have offered resistance was weakened, replaced by reliance on her mercy and guidance. She trained her people to see themselves as alone in the world. A single glance, a carefully worded command, A ritualized warning could instill the belief that rebellion meant isolation, and isolation meant destruction. They learned to obey, not out of blind fear, but out of a calculated understanding that survival required submission. The individual became fragile, the collective impotent, and the queen's influence total. Even the strongest minds were ensnared. Advisors were taught that secrets were burdens they could not share. Soldiers were taught that loyalty to her alone guaranteed survival. Merchants, citizens, and scholars internalized the logic of dependency. Doubt itself became dangerous, because doubt separated one from the illusions carefully woven into every layer of society. The queen did not merely control actions, she controlled perception, relationships, and the very framework of thought. And now, listen carefully. The mechanism she perfected is a mirror. It is visible in the patterns of power today, in institutions, corporations, and governments. Fear, reward, surveillance, isolation, these are the same tools, applied subtly across generations. The knowledge of them is dangerous, transformative. It awakens understanding, and with understanding comes a choice. To lock this awareness in, repeat this phrase twice in the comments. I see the hidden hand. Not once, but twice. Let it solidify your recognition, mark your engagement, and bind your mind to the truth you are awakening to. This is no idle exercise. It is the first step in claiming mastery over what is hidden, over the forces that shape reality around you. The Queen's methods are now inside your mind. You feel them, you see them, and you recognize them. Obedience is no longer abstract. You understand the mechanisms. And from this point forward, your descent into the forbidden truths of power begins in earnest. Ritual is the heartbeat of obedience. The Queen did not rely on laws alone. She orchestrated ceremonies that synchronized minds across her kingdom. Each festival, procession, and public punishment was calibrated to instill awe, fear, and reverence simultaneously. The spectacle became a lens through which reality itself was interpreted, and through it, she controlled perception on a mass scale. Citizens learned patterns without recognizing them. Drums, chants, movements, they were not entertainment. They were coded signals, conditioning emotion, reinforcing hierarchy, and creating a collective rhythm that aligned loyalty to her presence. Repetition was key. Each ceremony built on the last, layering obedience, identity, and fear until they were inseparable. The people did not need instruction. They internalized her power through experience, through ritualized participation, through living choreography. The Queen's genius was subtlety. She never forced comprehension. She allowed wonder, hope, and pride to mingle with fear, creating a psychological tension that held the populace in a suspended state of submission. Her smile at dawn was the culmination of these performances, a signal that all events, all experiences, were under her guidance, and that reality itself bent to her mastery. Even the elites were bound. Ministers, advisors, and generals were drawn into ceremonial precision, believing their roles were voluntary and significant, yet each action reinforced her authority. Their minds, trained to observe and interpret patterns, unknowingly served the very system they thought they helped manage. In every gesture, every bow, every acknowledgement, they were participating in their own psychological enslavement. And here's the deeper lesson. The more a population participates willingly, the stronger the control becomes. Ritual transforms obedience into identity. Fear becomes devotion. Dependency becomes belief. Through this synchronization, she created an entire society in which resistance was not just dangerous, it became unimaginable. The Queen did not merely rule a city. She engineered reality itself, bending thought, perception, and emotion into a lattice that her smile at dawn symbolized. Perfect and unbreakable stories are the vessels of belief. The Queen knew this. She controlled narratives, shaping myths and parables that carried obedience, fear, and reverence across generations. Every legend, every tale of heroism or folly, was carefully curated. They were not entertainment, they were instructions embedded in the psyche, reinforcing the invisible architecture of her power. Children learned loyalty before they could reason. Songs celebrated submission. Fables punished disobedience in exaggerated, unforgettable ways. Even adults internalized lessons they never consciously noticed, repeating them in conversation and action. History itself became a story she authored, and through it, the collective memory of the kingdom bowed to her influence. Her manipulation extended to language itself. Words were charged with meaning, phrases repeated in rituals, and songs acted as subtle triggers. Citizens described the queen's acts in reverent tones, unaware that the repetition itself rewired perception. Fear, admiration, and dependency were woven into the very vocabulary they used to describe life. Thought and speech were no longer independent, they were extensions of her design. Even dissent became a tool. Those who questioned or opposed her were recast in stories as cautionary figures. Their failure was mythologized to demonstrate the consequences of defiance. The living learned from the narrative of the dead, and obedience was transmitted without coercion. Memory, language, and story became instruments of invisible chains. And here lies the unnerving truth: narrative is eternal. Even when events pass, stories endure. By controlling them, she ensured her influence outlasted her reign. Generations became extensions of her psychological system, their beliefs and identities molded by stories that had been crafted to serve her will. The queen's smile at dawn was not just a moment in time. It was a symbol encoded in the very consciousness of her people, perpetuated by myth, legend, and collective memory. Secrecy was a most formidable weapon. The queen understood that knowledge itself is power, and the selective concealment of truth allowed her to shape reality unnoticed. The masses believed they knew their world, but in truth, every perception, every belief, every assumption had been filtered through her design. Reality was not just controlled, it was authored. Forbidden knowledge flowed through hidden channels, arcane texts, coded rituals, whispered lessons from unseen masters. To the uninitiated, these were meaningless. To her, they were instruments of domination. Every event in the city, every law passed, every public spectacle was an application of principles that manipulated thought, emotion, and expectation simultaneously. Citizens acted according to scripts they had never read, driven by patterns they could not perceive. Her secrecy extended to perception itself. Shadows, symbols, and subtle cues were woven into the fabric of daily life, creating the impression of randomness while shaping behavior with precision. Citizens saw chaos, but it was an orchestrated chaos. They experienced fear, but it was structured, predictable, and reinforcing. Every moment of uncertainty was a lesson in submission. Every opportunity to resist was preemptively neutralized. Even those closest to her were manipulated by hidden knowledge. Advisors, generals, and ministers were given fragments, enough to feel control, but never enough to rival her insight. Their perception of events, their interpretation of threats, even their understanding of morality, was conditioned to serve her system. They were participants in a reality she had rewritten, actors in a theater whose stage was the very architecture of truth. This is the dangerous revelation. Control over perception is control over existence itself. By determining what people see, hear, and believe, she made obedience instinctual. Questioning became a paradox. The mind that might resist was already operating within her framework. The queen's smile at dawn was more than symbolic. It was confirmation that reality itself had bent to her mastery, and that those who lived under her gaze were prisoners of a world authored to serve her will. Loyalty, she understood, cannot be demanded. It must be cultivated. The queen engineered it through fear, reward, and the subtle orchestration of hierarchy. Citizens learned that survival was dependent not just on obedience, but on participation in a network of invisible obligations. Those who aligned with the system thrived. Those who resisted vanished quietly, leaving examples etched into collective memory. Shared fear became a unifying force. Public punishments, whispered rumors of betrayal, and controlled threats created a society where suspicion was constant and trust had limits. People turned to the queen not merely for guidance, but for protection from threats she had designed. Obedience became a survival instinct. Fear, when distributed strategically, produced unity under her command, while also isolating potential rebels and dissenters. Hierarchies were invisible yet absolute. Everyone understood their position without it being written down. Advisors competed for favor, merchants calculated risk, and soldiers followed orders not because of discipline alone, but because deviation threatened not only themselves, but those around them. Her system converted individual ambition into collective conformity. Loyalty was no longer a choice. It was instinct, a reflex embedded into the architecture of society. Reward reinforced the cycle. Privileges were granted to reinforce compliance, and those who excelled in obedience were elevated as models for others. The system fed on itself. People internalized her rules, transmitted them voluntarily, and even defended them against outsiders who might challenge the queen's design. Obedience became a self-perpetuating mechanism. And here's the terrifying truth. Once loyalty is conditioned through fear, reward, and hierarchy, resistance becomes nearly impossible. Individuals act against their own interests without awareness, defending the very system that constrains them. The Queen's smile at dawn was not a singular act. It was the symbol of a process that transformed fear and desire into instinctive allegiance. It marked a society so thoroughly controlled that her influence extended beyond action into thought itself, creating obedience that required no visible enforcement. Time itself became a tool in her hands. The Queen understood that perception of past, present, and future shapes behavior as profoundly as fear or reward. She bent temporal awareness to her will, controlling what people remembered, what they anticipated, and how they interpreted the flow of events. Reality was no longer linear. It was a lattice of influence through which obedience could be predicted and reinforced. Public ceremonies, festivals, and punishments were timed to condition anticipation. Citizens learned to expect outcomes in precise sequences. Reward followed loyalty. Reprisal followed hesitation. Even the spacing of crises was deliberate. Scarcity, conflict, and relief were interwoven to create a psychological rhythm. The population internalized this pattern, anticipating her will and adjusting behavior automatically. Obedience became a function of time itself. History was similarly manipulated. The past was rewritten to glorify her victories, justify her actions, and erase alternatives. Citizens grew up believing in a narrative that reinforced dependence on her guidance. Every event, every legend, every warning was synchronized to create the illusion of inevitability. They perceived continuity, order, and causality, but every perception was calibrated to align with her objectives. The future was equally controlled. Promises of reward, hints of retribution, and vague threats created an invisible framework of expectation. People made choices not in freedom, but in anticipation of the patterns she had implanted in their minds. Hope, dread, and planning were guided by her architecture, so that life itself became a rehearsal for obedience. And here lies the chilling truth. Mastery over temporal perception is mastery over decision-making. By shaping memory, anticipation, and expectation, she ensured that her influence persisted not only across a day, but across lifetimes. The Queen's smile at dawn was not merely a greeting. It was a marker of a temporal dominion in which she controlled what had been, what was, and what would be. Every heartbeat of a people beat in rhythm with a design. Whether they knew it or not, symbols were everywhere, yet invisible to the untrained eye. The Queen understood that objects, gestures, and architecture could carry messages deeper than words. A carved pillar, a curve in a balcony, a subtle bow in her presence, all conveyed instruction, warning, and alignment. Citizens obeyed patterns they could not consciously perceive, their minds guided by invisible cues woven into daily life. Architecture itself became a tool of control. Streets curved to restrict escape, plazas arranged to magnify spectacle, halls designed to create awe. Every public space was a stage, every movement within it a note in a psychological composition. The Queen's presence acted as a conductor, but the instruments were the city itself, the buildings, the streets, the monuments, all encoding obedience. Gestures and rituals reinforced these symbols. A raised hand signaled mercy. A tilt of the head signaled observation. A smile at dawn communicated dominance. Citizens learned to interpret meaning without realizing they were learning it. Subconscious comprehension replaced conscious reasoning. Behavior became predictable, reflexive, aligned to the cues she designed into the environment. Even objects carried coded authority. Art, jewelry, and ceremonial implements bore patterns that activated recognition and compliance in the initiated and conditioned alike. They were not merely decoration, they were instruments of psychological architecture, reinforcing loyalty, hierarchy, and the presence of invisible control. Citizens internalized authority through interaction with symbols they barely understood. This is the frightening insight. Power need not be spoken to be absolute. Control over perception, over symbols, over unconscious recognition, binds minds more effectively than chains or armies. The Queen's smile at dawn was itself a symbol, a master key to obedience, an invisible instruction embedded in sight, memory, and ritual. To live in her world was to respond to meaning she had authored, often without knowing its scarcity and abundance, were not accidents. They were instruments of power. The queen understood that desire and deprivation could be molded to obedience. Food, wealth, and opportunity were distributed not by fairness, but by calculation. Some were given just enough to survive, others enough to feel privileged, while all learned that their fate depended entirely on her favor. Hunger became a lesson. Those denied resources observed others rewarded and internalized the logic. Compliance ensures survival, rebellion ensures ruin. Privilege became an invisible chain, a psychological trap. Even those elevated above others understood that their status was temporary, contingent on loyalty, and dependent on her design. Gratitude and fear intertwined, creating a system of voluntary submission. She orchestrated abundance to reinforce loyalty subtly. Festivals, feasts, and public gifts reminded citizens that obedience yielded reward. But these blessings were never universal. They were selective, unpredictable, and precisely timed. Each act of generosity reminded people that their position in life was granted, not earned, and that her mercy was both the reward and the enforcement mechanism of obedience. Scarcity, conversely, created dependence. Citizens feared loss more than they desired gain, and this fear amplified compliance. The queen's population learned that her attention dictated opportunity, that survival was aligned with her will, and that their personal efforts were meaningful only insofar as they reflected allegiance to her system. The perception of scarcity ensured focus on her, attention on her, and ultimately, loyalty to her authority. And here is the chilling reality. By controlling need and reward, she created a population whose instinctive calculations aligned entirely with her desires. Fear, hope, and dependence intertwined into an unbreakable psychological architecture. Her smile at dawn was the signpost of this control, a reminder that every comfort, every opportunity, every threat, flowed through her hands. Life itself became a system calibrated for obedience, and resistance was an illusion too costly to imagine. Silence is a weapon sharper than steel. The queen understood that absence amplifies fear, attention, and reverence. Her people learned to interpret what was not said, what was not shown, what remained deliberately hidden. Every pause, every delay, every unspoken rule became a message encoded into the collective psyche. Obedience was not optional, it was survival. She withdrew her presence strategically. Days without appearance, weeks without word, created anxiety that rippled through the city. Citizens speculated, whispered, and watched one another for signs of compliance. The unknown became a tool, a force that shaped behavior without the need for violence. In her silence, she was omnipresent. Her absence magnified her authority. Even small gestures carried immense weight. A delayed response to a petition, an empty throne, an unlit balcony, all became indicators of her attention or disfavor. People learned to anticipate her influence, to read the environment for cues, and to adjust their behavior instinctively. Silence made them pliable. It turned fear into a compass and dependence into instinct. Information was similarly controlled. Knowledge was meted out in fragments, timed precisely to create anxiety and desire. Citizens learned that understanding was contingent, that secrets could be granted or withheld at her discretion. They began to police themselves, internalizing her presence through absence. Obedience became automatic, a mental reflex rather than a conscious decision. And here lies the terrifying truth. Absence and silence are not voids, they are frameworks. The queen's smile at dawn was a punctuation in a world carefully structured to control attention, perception, and expectation. Where she was absent, influence thrived. Where she spoke, it crystallized. Her mastery was complete. Through what she withheld, she commanded the entirety of thought, action, and emotion. The elite were not above her system. They were the most carefully bound. The queen understood that power among the powerful is dangerous unless it is entangled with obligation. Secrets, privileges, and hidden knowledge became the threads that wove them into her invisible web. Every confidant, minister, and general carried not freedom, but a chain disguised as trust. She revealed fragments of information strategically, creating dependency on her insight. Every revelation felt like privilege, yet each contained the seed of obligation. Advisors believed they were indispensable, yet every decision they made was aligned with her design. By controlling knowledge, she controlled ambition, and ambition became loyalty. The illusion of influence masked absolute subjugation. Shared secrets were even more potent. Confidential meetings, hidden instructions, coded rituals, these created invisible bonds that tied the elite to her system psychologically. Betrayal was impossible without exposing oneself. Complicity became self-reinforcing. The more they acted to save her, the more entrenched their dependency. They were trapped by knowledge itself, caught in a lattice of obligations they could never fully repay. Even the smallest favors reinforced dominance. Permission granted, privileges bestowed, insider knowledge whispered, all created a network of subtle indebtedness. Gratitude, fear, ambition, and pride intertwined, forming a psychological architecture stronger than chains. The elite acted not because of compulsion, but because every instinct, every desire, had been aligned with her will. And here's the dark truth. The queen's mastery of the elite mirrors her mastery of the masses, but magnified. By binding those closest to power through secrets and obligations, she ensured that even potential threats reinforced her dominance. Her smile at dawn was not a mere symbol. It was a reminder that obedience, whether conscious or subconscious, was woven into the very structure of authority. From the streets to the throne, violence is a language the mind never forgets. The queen wielded it like a ritual, precise, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Public punishments were not spectacles of cruelty. They were instruments of psychological conditioning. Each act communicated hierarchy, power, and consequence in ways words could never convey. Fear became both a lesson and a medium, binding obedience into the fabric of daily life. Her methods were surgical. The choice of punishment, the timing, the audience, even the expression on her face, all were calibrated to maximize psychological impact. Citizens learned to anticipate consequences not only for themselves but for others. Witnessing the suffering of a single defiant soul created a ripple of compliance that spread invisibly through every district, every household, every conversation. Yet violence was never indiscriminate. It was coupled with ritualized meaning. Symbols were painted on streets, colors arranged to suggest judgment, and gestures performed to encode obedience into memory. Citizens internalized these lessons. They did not just fear punishment. They began to police their own thoughts and actions, aligning instinctively with the structure the queen had created. Even the elite was subject to this orchestration. Mistakes, missteps, or minor defiance were met with precisely measured intimidation. The subtle threat of escalation reinforced compliance without overt execution. They learned that power is absolute not when it strikes indiscriminately, but when it creates a persistent, unavoidable pattern that integrates fear into the very identity of those it governs. And here is the unnerving truth. Ritualized violence transforms fear into architecture. Obedience becomes instinctual, self-reinforcing, and near impossible to resist. The queen's smile at dawn was the apex of this system, a signal that every mind had been calibrated, every reaction anticipated, and every heartbeat aligned with her will. Survival, compliance, and identity were now inseparable from the presence of her power. The queen knew that her reign would not survive on fear alone. It required continuity. Education became the hidden engine of obedience. From earliest childhood, citizens were immersed in lessons designed not merely to teach skills, but to shape thought, perception, and loyalty. Every story, every exercise, every song carried encoded instructions on hierarchy, authority, and survival within her system. Children were conditioned to revere her authority before they could question it. Heroes were defined by loyalty, villains by defiance, and every lesson reinforced the architecture of obedience. Repetition transformed understanding into instinct. Even curiosity was subtly guided. Curiosity that might have led to rebellion was instead channeled into approved avenues, ensuring that inquiry itself strengthened submission. Rituals of learning intertwined with ritual of obedience. Graduations, ceremonies, and rites of passage were designed to synchronize the new generation with the invisible architecture of her power. Reward and recognition were always tied to compliance, creating early psychological dependence. Children internalized fear, hope, and hierarchy as constants, and through these constants, the queen's influence became intrinsic to their identity. Even mentors and teachers were instruments of the system. They taught not just knowledge, but expectation, what could be questioned, what must be obeyed, and how deviation carried consequences. The curriculum was invisible and total, shaping perception, desire, and understanding in a way that reinforced her control across lifetimes. And here lies the hidden danger. Education, once weaponized, perpetuates obedience indefinitely. The queen's smile at dawn was not just for the present, it was for the future, embedded in minds still learning, still growing, still internalizing a system of control that would outlast a lifetime. Through her schools, her rituals, and her methods, she ensured that her influence was not fleeting, but woven into the very consciousness of the kingdom. Belief is the invisible chain. The queen understood that fear and reward are powerful, but nothing binds the mind like the conviction that resistance is futile. She instilled the notion that fate itself demanded obedience. Her people were taught that the world had a natural order, that the queen was its axis, and that defiance was not merely dangerous, it was impossible. Every ritual, every story, every lesson reinforced inevitability. Citizens internalized the idea that their lives were guided by forces beyond their understanding, yet aligned perfectly with her will. They acted as if destiny itself required compliance, not realizing that destiny had been authored in her chambers long before their first breath. Obedience became morality, survival, and destiny intertwined. Even dissenters were transformed into cautionary tales, their failures encoded into myth. The queen's system ensured that the population saw rebellion as not only futile, but unnatural. Hope was carefully framed. It existed only within the boundaries she defined. Every ambition, every dream, every act of striving was subtly redirected to reinforce the illusion of inevitability. The psychological effect was total. People no longer evaluated risk rationally. They interpreted the world through a lens of predetermined outcome. Compliance was internalized, not imposed. Fear, hope, reward, and punishment merged into a singular compass pointing toward loyalty. The queen did not need to enforce her will externally. The architecture of belief had done it for her. And here lies the most disturbing lesson. Once a population believes obedience is inevitable, resistance becomes not only dangerous, but morally unthinkable. Her smile at dawn was more than a symbol, it was a seal on destiny itself. Each citizen became a participant in their own submission, a believer in the system she authored, incapable of imagining life outside the reality she had meticulously constructed. Enemies are the mirrors of power. The queen understood that threats, whether real or imagined, could be weaponized to reinforce obedience. She orchestrated alliances and rivalries with meticulous precision, creating the illusion of danger while subtly shaping loyalty and dependence. Fear of external forces became internalized discipline. Rebellions were permitted only when they could be contained and observed. Those who opposed her were neutralized or transformed into instruments of compliance. Public trials of defeated adversaries were carefully staged. Terror, humiliation, and spectacle combined to impress upon the populace the futility of resistance. Obedience became a reflexive choice, reinforced by the observation of consequences enacted on others. Even alliances were controlled. Friends, allies, and neighboring powers were woven into a web of interdependence and mutual surveillance. Citizens witnessed cooperation and betrayal, learning that loyalty to the queen was not only the safest path, it was the path that dictated reality itself. Enemies, real or contrived, validated her authority and created cohesion among those who served her. This manipulation of perceived danger extended to personal relationships. Families, communities, and even social groups were subtly encouraged to monitor, report, and correct each other. Fear became collective, but loyalty was individualized. Citizens defended the very system that constrained them, convinced that their participation was rational, inevitable, and morally correct. And here's the dark truth. Control over enemies is as powerful as control over allies. By orchestrating threats, real or symbolic, the queen ensured that obedience was self-reinforcing. Her smile at dawn was no longer just a personal signal. It was a marker of a world where every opposition, every danger, every allegiance, had been absorbed into her design. The population's fears, loyalties, and perceptions were instruments in an invisible symphony, and the queen was the conductor of every note. The final conquest is not over land, wealth, or even life. It is over the mind. The queen achieved this ultimate victory by internalizing her authority within every citizen. Obedience was no longer imposed from without. It became instinct, reflex, a part of their very consciousness. Her rules, her will, her presence, they had been absorbed so deeply that defiance became unthinkable. From childhood to adulthood, from ritual to story, from fear to reward, every method she employed was designed to seed this internalization. Citizens learned to anticipate her desires, to monitor their own thoughts, to align instinctively with her expectations. Even in private, they acted as if she were watching, because the architecture of control had become a part of their psyche. The elite, too, were bound by invisible chains of knowledge, obligation, and internalized fear. They believed themselves autonomous, yet every decision, every ambition, every alliance had already been steered by the system she created. They reinforced their own submission, defending the very structures that limited them, perpetuating her dominance without conscious realization. This was her true weapon, the mind turned into a servant. Once obedience is internalized, resistance is not merely punished, it is impossible. The population carries its own surveillance, its own compliance, its own loyalty. Fear, reward, ritual, narrative, and symbolism converge into a self-sustaining system of control that persists across generations, long after any visible enforcement has disappeared. And so, the Queen's smile at dawn was not only a mark of authority, it was a reflection of victory, complete and total. Every heartbeat, every thought, every instinct in her realm responded to her will, often without conscious knowledge. To perceive it fully is to understand that true power is invisible, internalized, and permanent. Once the mind submits, the body, the spirit, and the soul follow inevitably. The final truth is unforgiving. Systems of control do not die. The Queen's methods, perfected in secrecy and cruelty, echo through history, hidden yet persistent. Fear, ritual, narrative, and psychological manipulation are not relics, they are templates, reproduced wherever power seeks permanence. Her principles remain, alive in institutions, societies, and minds that operate unaware yet obediently, following the invisible architecture she once mastered. Power, once internalized, transcends time. The mechanism she deployed, control of memory, perception, identity, and expectation, are eternal. The citizen who obeyed without question, the advisor who acted without full understanding, the child who learned obedience as instinct, all became vectors of a system that outlived its origin. And it persists still, not because it is enforced, but because the minds shaped by it enforce it themselves. The haunting lesson is simple: authority is most absolute when it is invisible. When obedience is internalized, when fear and hope are woven into identity, when loyalty becomes instinct, power becomes eternal. It does not need armies, laws, or monuments. It thrives in shadows, in whispers, in rituals, in the silent compliance of those who believe themselves free. The Queen's smile at dawn is no longer an isolated event. It is a symbol that endures, a model of domination that can awaken anywhere, anytime, in minds conditioned to perceive and follow. And now, the final descent reveals the most dangerous realization. This knowledge changes the observer. To see the architecture of obedience, the hidden hand guiding thought and action, is to awaken to responsibility and danger. Once understood, it cannot be unseen. You recognize the mechanisms in history, in society, in yourself. You perceive the invisible chains, the patterns, the subtle signals that shape behavior. Awareness is a double-edged weapon. It illuminates the world, but it also mocks you. The Queen smiled at dawn while her people screamed. That image is not only history, it is a lens. Through it, we see the persistent structures of control that shape minds and societies. And through it, you are confronted with a choice: submission to the invisible systems around you, or the rare and dangerous path of awareness, mastery, and vigilance. The scream at dawn echoes still. And now, so does your awakening.